So welcome to AF Live, a webcast featuring interviews with people working on the front lines of conservation. Today we're joined by a conservation hero, Joseph Poux from the United States Justice Department. Joseph, welcome to AF.
Glad to be here, Andrew, and thank you very much for the invitation. I'm flattered.
It's a pleasure, seriously. So can you tell us what it is that you do, please, Joe?
Sure. My current role is I'm Deputy Chief of the Environmental Crimes Section here at the U.S. Department of Justice. The Environmental Crimes Section is a special unit of prosecutors who do nothing but prosecute environmental crimes throughout the United States. There's about 37 of us at the moment. Our numbers generally fluctuate between 35 and 40. I am in a division, the Environment and Natural Resources Division here at DOJ. It's made up of 9 litigating sections. We're the only criminal section. There's approximately 400 plus lawyers in the division, and so we make up 10% of the Environment and Natural Resources Division.
So you're the guy people have to face if they commit an environmental crime?
I used to be. Now we hire much better people to do that. But yes, as the deputy chief, I help direct strategy and so forth.
Firstly, how did you get into your line of work?
Well, it's kind of it's not a normal route for most prosecutors. I was a public defender in Maryland for 10 years, right out of law school. And after 10 years, started thinking I wanted to do something else. My former clinic supervisor, who's my current boss, had the same issue come up. He was a public defender and knew someone at the environmental crime section, and so joined that a few years before I did. And then when I called her suggesting it was time to do something else, she suggested I apply to the environmental crime section. As I mentioned, public defenders not normally good friends of prosecutors, so I could either come do environmental crimes or civil rights, but that was about it. So environmental crimes seemed like a great job.
And what is the history behind the environmental crime section? When was it established?
Well, as I said, the Environment and Natural Resource Division that we're in used to be called the Lands Division. It is one of the oldest divisions in the Department of Justice. It was started in 1909. Since that time, when they started their environmental enforcement program, it was primarily civil. In the 1970s, as you know, the Clean Water Act and the Clean Air Act were passed, huge legislation that impacted the environmental enforcement program in the United States. At the time, they made some of the offenses for the first time misdemeanors. Misdemeanors meaning carries a year or less in jail. In 1980, in the early 80s, for the first time, they passed the Resource Conservation and Recovery Act that provided felonies for environmental crimes. It was also about that time that EPA's Criminal Investigation Division was starting to form. So because we now had felonies and more serious charges, there was a thought to start an environmental crimes unit. That unit initially consisted of 4 prosecutors within our civil division, or our civil counterpart, the Environmental Enforcement Section. And in 1987, they added felonies to the Clean Water Act. And that's when they decided that they needed a bigger standalone unit, and that's when the Environmental Crime Section was started. We went from 4 to 18 attorneys, and then, as I said, EPA CID was formally stood up then, and so we had criminal investigative counterparts. And I will say, I think it's 2008, our counterparts in the wildlife section, federal prosecutors prosecuting wildlife crime, came down to join us. And so the environmental crime section, when I started, was all pollution. Now our mandate has grown where we have wildlife crimes, we have illegal logging, and many other statutes. So we go far beyond pollution.
And do other countries around the world have a similar department or unit?
Well, I am a little biased. I like to think we are the best. Other countries have similar models, but probably not as large, discrete unit. My colleagues in Europe, for example, I have 1 or 2 environmental prosecutors in their prosecutorial office. Other countries are starting to start them up. There's also an issue as to whether you should have environmental courts as opposed to criminal courts for these cases. And so I think the rest of the world is coming along. But in terms of the penalties and the types of cases we pursue, I think the United States is above the rest of the world in terms of criminal prosecutions of environmental crimes.
Can I ask, so you mentioned the different focus areas, can I ask how your docket is currently split across those areas?
In terms of number of cases that we have, it's probably close to 50-50 between wildlife and pollution cases. Now, in terms of attorney hours, it's probably a little more on the pollution side because some of those investigations are multi-district, white-collar investigations, so take a little more time to complete. But we went from having no wildlife cases in 2008 to half our docket being wildlife cases.
Talking of wildlife cases, so the Lacey Act, that was one of the original pieces of legislation worldwide. So how does that impact you guys? And could you give us a little bit more background to that legislation, please?
Yeah. No, I wish we had something similar in the pollution side, but it's a great tool that we've been able to use both within the United States and outside the United States. And essentially, if you're breaking your law, you're breaking our law, and so that gives us a lot of leverage to prosecute cases. Depending on the amount, can be significant jail time involved, and so that's been a major part of our docket.
Thank you. And just to jump to international relationships, how closely do you guys work with Interpol?
Funny you should ask. I'm actually chairman of Interpol's Pollution Crime Working Group, which is made up of 8 other board members and approximately 80 countries. And environmental enforcement folks, police from those countries make up the working group, and we work with Interpol proper. We have a pollution team in Singapore, and so work very closely with them. I've had that position for about 5 years, and for the last 3 years, we've conducted a very successful multinational operations. The key is to try and get countries talking and working together.
Excellent. And what is the role of whistleblowers in this, kind of the importance, and do you get helped a lot by whistleblowers in your prosecutions?
We do. One of my roles here is I supervise our national vessel pollution program. And under our statutes, one in particular, the Act to Prevent Pollution from Ships, people who provide information that lead to a conviction are eligible to get up to half the criminal fine. Now, the maximum criminal fine in these cases is $500,000 per count. So if you have 4 counts, that's $2 million. That's quite a bit of money for whistleblowers. Mm-hmm. Most of our whistleblowers in that context are these merchant mariners who make very little money, maybe $500 a month, that come over. And the United States is known as a state that prosecutes these cases and cares about the illegal dumping. So they will frequently wait till they come here. Probably when our program started 20 years ago, most of our cases came from inspections. I would say probably 85-90% of our cases now come from whistleblowers. The sophistication of how these illegal discharges from ships takes place has grown over the years, and it would be very difficult to uncover those just through normal inspections. So having someone who's in the engine room who takes pictures and takes videos, and I'll tell you, some of these guys do better PowerPoints than I do, and so they contact us, they contact the Coast Guard, and it would be hard pressed to do the number of cases we've done without them. In terms of the rest of our cases, we don't really have much in the area of whistleblowers. The Lacey Act has a reward fund that's administered by the Fish and Wildlife Service, and the numbers are nowhere near what they are under the Act to Prevent Pollution from Ships. But having worked with whistleblowers for 15 years, I think they're a critical part of our cases.
And if someone is considering becoming a whistleblower, what advice would you give them? Can they approach your office directly?
Certainly, they can approach us. It depends what the actual violation would be. We see with vessel pollution going to the Coast Guard or the Coast Guard Investigative Service. I mean, for a whistleblower, I guess my first piece of advice would be make sure you're doing what you want to do, what you're about to do, because I can tell you firsthand, your life is going to change quite a bit. And so that's something only the whistleblower can answer. But after that, find someone that you trust, and they can be a third party. We've had the Seamen's Church, for example, with our mariners make contact. There are multiple whistleblower groups out there that can bring information to the Department of Justice. But we've also had a bunch of referrals to DOJ directly, and we'll make sure it gets to the right person.
And you mentioned the Seafarers group, so we'll provide a list of or a link to those guys at the bottom of the video as well. So if anyone's watching this and they want to report something. So just to touch on a couple of cases then, please. So Princess Cruises is one case that you successfully prosecuted. What happened there? Were they dumping oil in American coastal waters? And if not, how did you kind of get a hook into the case?
Generally, what happens in our vessel pollution cases is very little of the pollution occurs in U.S. waters or even other national waters. It's sort of a tragedy of the commons situation. Once they're over the horizon, they will dump their bilge oily waste overboard, and it's not really in anybody's jurisdiction, so it's not anybody's responsibility to enforce. Fortunately, under the regulations, ships are supposed to keep an official record of how they manage their waste, including dumping overboard or discharging. And the rule is they can't discharge waste that's more than 15 parts per million oil to water. And just roughly speaking, that would look like drinking water. And so if they discharge anything more than that, that's supposed to go in their log. So when they come to the United States and the Coast Guard does an inspection, they're supposed to be able to go through the entire record book and determine this is how they manage their waste. And that's when we find out that they've been discharging overboard in the ocean. And so that way we're able to address the harm of dumping at sea by using U.S. law, the Act to Prevent Pollution from Ships. And we get a lot of questions about how much of a problem environmentally this is. And I'd like to point out a stat that I've seen studies on. The Exxon Valdez, when it wrecked, discharged about 11 million gallons of oil. I've seen estimates that 88 million gallons of oil are discharged every year intentionally. And so that's like 8 Exxon Valdez's every year, just to give you some idea of the scope of the problem that we're seeing.
That's incredible. And can you give us an idea of the kind of fines that these companies end up having to pay?
Oh, yeah, I guess I left a big part out of Princess. Princess Cruise Lines a couple years ago, we caught them for the second time, and they ended up paying a $40 million criminal penalty. And that is the highest ever for a vessel pollution case. Ironically, they came back and were found to have violated probation and ended up paying another $20 million. So that's $60 million. And, what it would have cost to do things the right way, I'm guessing would be much less than $60 million.
Well, this might be a silly question, but what would it cost to legally get rid of that waste off the vessel when they got into the harbor?
We have heard different estimates, but high end, maybe a few $1,000s. Now, the cruise lines are much bigger ships, so it would cost more. But the amount of money the cruise lines have, or I guess had before this year, is incredible. So money is no object for them. So we deal with a lot of smaller vessels that are, let's say, more on the financial edge, but that's not the cruise lines.
Okay. And what are the kind of things that they're doing that are trying to cover the tracks in the engine room, for example, that the whistleblowers are able to alert you to?
There are several pieces of pollution prevention equipment that ships are required to use. One is an oily water separator, and it does pretty much what it sounds like. Before you pump overboard, you run your waste through it, and it separates the oil from the water. And if it's 15 parts per million or less, it goes overboard. If not, it gets put in a special tank and has to be discharged ashore. That piece of the equipment's finicky. It takes someone standing there all the time to operate it. There's only maybe 5 to 8 people in the engine room, so there's a lot of other responsibilities. So a lot of times what they will do is they will, in the beginning, in the old days, they would take a hose and run it from the intake side of the separator to the discharge valve on the ship. They call it a magic pipe or a magic hose. That still happens, but because they know the U.S. is looking at this, we see stuff that's much more sophisticated, pumping through boiler blowdown lines, through fire reductor lines. Again, the critical part there is those are not areas that the Coast Guard would normally inspect. So that is where the whistleblowers come in. They are, our man on the rock, so to speak, who can get us the information, the intel of what's happening in the engine room.
Okay, so just moving on now to Ivory. So you've had like rhino cases and with an organization. Is that Crash, is it?
Yes, Operation Crash was a big case that we had a few years. We still have a lot of them, and that involved the illegal, rhino horn trade, which again isn't, when you first think about it, the U.S. rhino population is very small. It's not something you would think comes from the United States. But you start to learn pretty quickly. Some of the raw horn or the finished horn could go from anywhere from $5,000 to $30,000 an ounce. I mean, some ways it's more valuable than gold. They have some of these special art libation cups that are made, crafted out of this rhino horn. Those could go for $250,000. So what was happening is, people wanted rhinos. The rhinos were, endangered. I think all 5 species were endangered at the time. And so there was a limited supply. And then folks, mainly in Asia, knew that there was stuff here in the U.S., mainly collector's items that folks had. And so they were coming over and buying rhino horn to sell back in Asia because of the money. We had some organized crime groups. The Irish travelers were coming over here to the United States, people just to buy either raw rhino horn or sculpted one. And the other part of it is we have hunters from the U.S. that would pay a lot of money to go over and shoot rhinos, which you can't do, but there's unscrupulous people in that part of the world that would be willing to take folks out. And, we prosecuted some of those guys as well. The outcome of that with our cases, I think we charged 50 people. There was over, I think, 60 years in jail from this, $2 million in fines, and forfeited $5.5 million worth of rhino horn from that case. So it was a big operation, but very successful.
Great stuff, fantastic. So just moving on to timber. So Lumber Liquidators was an organisation that you've also prosecuted. Can you tell us a little bit more about that, please?
Sure. Lumber Liquidators was the first criminal prosecution that we did involving illegal logging. It might be the first one in the world. We've looked at this before, but it is a very difficult case to put together because most of the timber is sourced outside the United States. In this case, it was coming from Siberia through China, and then through a couple countries into the United States. And as you're looking here, the inspectors at the border, it's very hard to tell legal wood from illegal wood. And so it was an area where people have been able to get away with for a long time. We were fortunate in this case to get some information from an outside NGO who had contacts in China and elsewhere, and were able to get us the actual information. I mean, interviews, paperwork that showed that the stuff was coming into the United States illegally. We have to go, make our own case after that, but they gave us the critical evidence to know what was the right information to ask for from Lumber Liquidators. They eventually settled the case and paid $13 million in criminal penalties, and part of that was they had to forfeit all the wood that had come in. But most importantly, as part of it, in our cases, the fines, jail time for individuals, that punishes past conduct. What we like to do is do something to deter or improve future conduct. So as part of our sentences, we generally require companies to implement an environmental compliance plan that puts, organizational processes in place to ensure that the same activity doesn't happen again. And in this area, it was certain processes and responsibilities the Lumber Liquidators had to do to ensure they did their due diligence. They knew where the wood was coming from. They were able to verify it wasn't illegally sourced. And because it was the first criminal case, we think that environmental compliance plan will set the standard for the rest of the industry. So the next company that comes along says, how were we supposed to tell it was a problem? Well, we can show what Lumber Liquidators had to do. And we got a lot of calls from the timber trade associations after that case.
And this case was, the timber was apparently going through China at the time. And you had cooperation from Interpol and EIA, I believe, the NGO.
EIA was, I'm sure I'm leaving someone out, so I'll get some angry letters perhaps after this. But I know EIA was one of the primary NGOs working in that area. And it's always challenging to get law enforcement to work with NGOs because they have different priorities in many cases. But I'll say EIA was great here in terms of agreeing not to do any publicity or anything till we had a chance to gather our evidence. So it was a very successful partnership.
And just moving on to Volkswagen was another major case that you guys have took on. So what happened there?
Well, Volkswagen claimed that their diesel engines were, environmentally friendly. And as it turns out, they were placing software in the engines that were sort of gaming the emissions testing when the cars were tested over here in the United States and elsewhere. And so the tests are very specific. And so they had software that could tell, if the engine's revving at this speed, blah, 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 you go into testing mode, which shuts down the emissions coming from the vehicle. And then, when you're out of testing mode and you brought your millions of cars into the U.S., then all bets are off. It was an unfortunate case for them because I think half of my environmental colleagues had a Volkswagen, and so and they bought it for those reasons. So they were not pleased. They eventually paid a $2.8 billion fine. They 6 individuals, corporate directors, were charged as a result of that case. 2 went to jail. It was difficult because the board of directors, were in Germany, and it's not likely that we're going to see them. But we charged the CEO of Volkswagen at the time with knowing about this. And the thing that was shocking was that as the case unfolded, this wasn't a decision that wasn't a rogue employee. This was information that went right to the top in the boardroom, and it was a conscious decision that they made. And the harm from the illegal emissions to human health here was quite significant.
Absolutely. And what advice would you give a CEO of an organization that's wanting to stay on the right side of the law?
Be thorough. You need to be able to come in and be able to feel comfortable that you're getting, first of all, the answers that you need, that you're putting meaningful resources into your environmental compliance program, and that you have the right people in those jobs. Well, what we see in a lot of times is that it's lip service. You've got some guy who's head of environmental management and health and safety, 4 different jobs that, probably require 4 different people. He has no direct report to the board or the chairman, and so doesn't get a lot of power or leverage within the company. And so other employees know that. They're able to tell if it's a priority to the company. So getting the message, as we say in vessel cases, from the boardroom to the engine room is critical, or else you just have a paper plan. And we've seen cases where people have great plans. They take up bookshelves. The spine has never been cracked. It's covered in dust. So just having a paper plan isn't going to do anything.
And what advice would you give someone wanting to become an environmental prosecutor?
Well, what are they waiting for? We're running out of time. It's all hands. So I would say, come on board. We need you. The one thing that is interesting or unusual, I think, with the environmental criminal program is it is environmental crime. And so a strong grounding in the environment and the sciences is very important. But it is also the criminal prosecution part. So you need to have developed litigation skills that you can use and put those 2 tools together. I mean, you can show up and say, I believe in the environment, but if you can't try a case, you're not going to be able to do very much. So I would say, and you probably want to do it early on because the pay is poor to get that litigation experience and going to a local prosecutor's office or a public defender's office. So you better do it while you're young. You can afford it. And just keep doing that. Get those trial skills developed. And so when you come in and you want to be an environmental prosecutor, you've got those skills already honed and can get to work.
What book would you recommend? Has there been a book that you've read that's really inspired your work?
Not on the environmental side. I was trying to think of that. Most of the books that would think of are non-environmental. My favorite book would be Les Miserables, which isn't really environmental, though a lot of it takes place in the sewers, which I believe were illegally discharging into the Seine. So that might have an environmental hook there.
Fantastic. Thank you for that recommendation. Well, Joseph, it's been a real honor to have you join us on Earth Live, and we want to thank you on behalf of ourselves and the viewers for the amazing work you and your department do. So thank you so much.
I appreciate it, Andrew. It's been an honor and a privilege. Thank you very much.
Take care, sir. Bye-bye.